I just want to talk with you just a few moments from a clergy standpoint. I too was in Ferguson. I live in Florissant, Missouri, and the to Ferguson is a long one that I share with you some other time. But there are things that I think are helpful to those who want to show up and protest as people of faith, particularly as clergy in this moment. Um, when Ferguson uprising began, um, we had a lot of confusion when we started. One of the reasons we had confusion is because many clergy, most clergy, did not have relationship with the protesters that ended up in the streets in the beginning. And it is important that we recognize as clergy that if we don't have that relationship, we don't have to be ashamed of that. We are there now. We don't have to not show up. That is not what I'm saying. But I am saying that we cannot expect to lead where we have not been. So when we show up in protest as clergy, we must respect the leadership that is in place at that protest. It's helpful if at clergy you have as clergy you have the ability to set your own affinity group and have your own meetings. And the reason this is helpful is for some of the reasons that PJ talked about. Because as anxiety rises, as stress rises, as unknown and unexpected things begin to happen, the anxiety internally begins to rise. And if you have not grounded yourself as a community, spent some time talking about what your role is going to be in the streets, you can end up doing more harm than help. So in Ferguson, the clergy got together and decided what our role will be. And I'm not suggesting that in every area the role has to be the same, but for us, we decided that we were going to be the keepers of the story. We were going to be the ones who would use their authority, their position, their collars, their stoles, their whatever your tradition calls for. We were going to come in that and make sure that we were the keepers of the story, that we were not going to allow media, we were not going to allow law enforcement, we were not going to allow elected officials to tell a story that was not accurate and was not true. And we were not going to allow protesters who were simply fighting for the right to exist without persecution and prosecution to be painted as something that they were not. We were the keepers of the story. One of the ways we did that was we created teams of two clergy as partners, two clergy partnering together, and we had a schedule. We committed to being in the street whenever protesters were in the street. That's a big commitment because, contrary to popular opinion, most clergy are not out in the street. And so, if you're going to do this, and if you're going to do it in a way that the protest community of which you would be saying you want to be a part can depend upon you, then you need to be reliable to show up in the streets. And so we would do that by having a partnership and having a schedule when we always knew who was assigned to be out in the streets. And if things got rough, if things got violent on that night, those two people would call and say, we need more clergy in the street, or those 6 people, or those 8 people. It varied depending upon the size of the protest. But we were clear about who we were and why we were there. PJ answered a question about standing in front of people to be a barrier between them and the police, or between them and violence, or whatever we might think we were doing. We did some of that in Ferguson, quite frankly, but we always did it in conjunction with the protesters whose leadership we were following. Following that leadership also meant that we had to leave some of our respectability and politeness at home. Now, I'm not asking that you be someone that you are not, and certainly I was not someone that I was not. There's certain language that I don't use, and I didn't use it. But I also did not try to police other people's voice their ways of expression, their language, their actions. That was not my role. My role was to be the keeper of the story and to be clear about what I stood for. And what I stand for is justice, wherever it is coming from. And in the cases of Ferguson and so many of the protests that have happened around this nation, justice stands with those who are being persecuted and prosecuted by militarized violence from law enforcement, from servants of the state, servants of the people. And we stood with protesters. We stood with them even when law enforcement got angry with us. We stood with them even when law enforcement called us traitors. We stood with them even when our collars made us targets instead of made us accomplices of law enforcement. You need to know what you stand for, who you stand for, before you go out into the streets. You are not there to police or to limit other people's expressions because they do things differently than you might do them. That is not helpful. The other thing clergy did, because so much violence happens in the dark, right, is that we orchestrated an identity garment for ourselves. I hated it. It looked like Elmer Fudd, but it was a neon garment that had clergy on the back, and there were caps as well that said clergy. And that wasn't really so much for identification for law enforcement as for identification for protesters who might need to talk to someone, who might need to step away for a moment and gather themselves, who might need the priest instead of the prophet for a moment. We were there identified in ways that the protesters who were often on the front lines, who were being tear gassed, et cetera, knew where we were and knew how to find us. The third thing I want to say, and I know my time is almost up, I want to say very clearly that it is not the role of clergy to negotiate on behalf of those leading the protests. Don't ever go to meetings with police officers, with legislators, with state officials. Don't ever go without the ones who are leading the protest. If they don't go, you cannot go. Because the other thing you are building in the streets is a trustworthy reputation, and that matters. Finally, if you have houses of faith that are in the perimeter or in the area of the protest, I urge you to not only go as an individual, but to bring your congregation into this fight. And it is a fight. So often in protest, when tear gas started going and rubber bullets were going, it was sad that so many church doors were closed. So many people didn't want to be places of retreat and risk their buildings, risk their institutions, risk their relationships to keep people safe from harm. And one of the ways churches can show up, one of the ways synagogues can show up, one of the ways temples can show up is to open your doors and be identified as a safe place for protesters when they need to come and have chemicals washed out of their eyes or removed from their skin, when they need a break from the intensity in the streets. Provide snacks, provide water, provide PPE, provide those things that will help people cleanse their eyes and cleanse their skin. The last thing I want to say is that prayer is always appropriate for those of us who believe. But prayer does not have to be public, does not have to be forced on others to be effective. Take your prayer with you, but pray with your feet and follow the leadership of those who have been in the streets, who know what's going on. Respect that leadership. Respect that leadership and keep the story. Thank you. Someone asked the question, how do houses of worship indicate that they are a sanctuary? I know in Ferguson, many of the young people would ask what houses of worship would be open for that. And there was a listing. Those who need to know. And being a sanctuary for protesters means that you do not allow law enforcement in. I want to make that clear. Being a sanctuary means that you do not voluntarily allow law enforcement to come in. So if you want to do that, I suggest you give the name of your church or your synagogue, your temple, your house, whatever that may be, to the organizers of the protest in your area so that they will know where to come. And if they come, when they come, no matter why they come, it is an obligation to keep them safe, from the forces that are chasing them. Thank you.